I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. Today's episode is a talk given by Peter Gray called Fly the Light, presented at the Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult conference held in London, 2016. Peter Gray is an author and the co-founder of the publishing company Scarlet Imprint. His books include The Red Goddess from 2007, which has become the standard work on the goddess of revelation, Babylon. His book Apocalyptic Witchcraft from 2013 has been called the most important modern book on witchcraft, placing it in the mythopoetic context of the Sabbath and in a landscape suffering climate and ecological collapse. He has spoken at public events and conferences internationally, including the Occult conferences, Treadwell's Bookshop in London, the Esoteric Book Conference in Seattle, our own Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult Conference, Here to Go in Norway, the Trans States Conference at Northampton University, and many Pagan Federation events. A long-term supporter of the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in his native Cornwall, his work on the Witches' Sabbath was first given at the annual Friends of the Museum gathering. His work has also appeared in numerous journals and collections, such as Carl Abrahamson's The Fenris Wolf. His collected writings from 2008 to 2018, along with those of his partner Alkistis Demek, are published in The Brazen Vessel, a collection which came out in 2019. His book, Lucifer Princeps, from 2015, is the study of the origins of the figure of Lucifer. He is currently writing the second part, Lucifer Praxis, which addresses working with the fallen angels of the Enochic tradition and their transvection into the grimoires and modern practice. On Sunday, September 19th, Peter Gray will be presenting his new book, The Two Antichrists, along with readings from Alkistis Demek at Morbid Anatomy online via Zoom as part of Occult 2021, Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult series held on Morbid Anatomy Museum Sundays this September. Opening with considerations on the future of witchcraft and its relation to radical ecology, Gray returns to the Babylon Working, a series of magic rituals performed in 1946 by occultist, author, and rocket fuel scientist Jack Parsons and founder of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, and considers a series of little examined texts from science fiction and the outer fringes of Scientology. By reading across these sources, the familiar story is revealed to have hidden depths and dimensions. Exploring the role of the Antichrist in relation to Parsons and Hubbard, Gray provides insights into the initiatory drama of Thelema. The Two Antichrists observes the long shadow cast by the monolith of Scientology. For more information, visit the PsychArtCult website, psychartcult.org. To sign up for Peter Gray's event at Morbid Anatomy, visit their events page at morbidanatomy.org/events. As with all Rendering Unconscious podcast episodes, there is a video of this episode at YouTube. Just search for Rendering Unconscious Podcast at YouTube, or head to Trapart Films YouTube channel. That's TRAPART Film at YouTube. This talk is included in a collection of papers from the first Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult conference held in London 2016, a special edition of the Fenris Wolf, Volume 9. Links to this book can be found in the text accompanying this episode.
By the light.
Good morning. I'm going to stand today for a couple of reasons, one of which being the amount of coffee I've drunk. The other one, because I'm talking about shadows, and the reason I, like a good magician, took the first seat is because I have that shadow profile. So if people start to wander off, as we all do when we attend these conferences, you can watch the shadow moving behind me and see what that says instead. The occult is traditionally seen by its practitioners as an art of shadows. Their calling, casting, conversation, and compulsion. From the figures on the cave wall to goetic ritual and necromantic inquiry, it is the shadow who has been our constant companion. Yet our companions have been anathematized. And so too have those of us who continue to traffic with them. In that descriptor, I include psychoanalysts, occultists, and artists. Today, I will argue that the shadow has been largely excised in late capitalist culture, and to make the counter-assertion that it is in the casting of shadows and the practice of the occult arts that we are the most complete. As occultists, we have developed a consistent set of strategies to navigate the unseen worlds. But these have a consistent physiological basis, which has been steadily eroded both by the monoculture and neglected by this generation of modern practitioners. Jung writes, again I'm not going to quote Freud today, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. Such an unpopular procedure is a hallmark of the eldritch realms of both psychoanalysis and the occult. The shadow being the unconscious, the devil with whom we seek conjuncture. It is what we fear and despise, both within ourselves and in the culture. But magic remains wary of psychoanalysis, and one does not have to be a Foucault to discern the reasons why. Psychoanalysis is easy to see as part of a continuum of control mechanisms, from state, church, school, factory, hospital, and prison. Another mechanism for producing and replicating compliant and well-adjusted workers. And from a witchcraft context, psychoanalysis is very much a descendant of the Inquisition, relying heavily on the testimony of damaged women to articulate its script. As occultists, our cure contains many of the performative and ritual elements that psychoanalysis as a talking cure entirely lacks. But we are, for the most part, literate traditions, with our jargons and procedures, and our preoccupation with making the darkness become visible. Psychoanalysis and the occult have many points in common. But psychoanalysis sought to exercise us, and perhaps continues to do so, in search of its own credibility. The occult could be described as the shadow of psychoanalysis. James Hillman, who remains popular in occult circles, wrote in 1976, "Some people, in desperation, have turned to witchcraft, magic and occultism, to drugs and madness, anything to rekindle the imagination and find a world in soul. But these reactions are not enough. What is needed is a revisioning, a fundamental shift of perspective out of that soulless predicament that we call modern consciousness." So Hillman disses drugs, sex, magic, the occult happily. But we have exactly the techniques and the answers that Hillman was looking for, though I'm mindful that modern occultism remains as reactive, immature, and ill-starred as the culture within which it is nested. Psychoanalysis, as perhaps this conference shows, must ultimately accept its Caliban, and Shakespeare gives us the simple ritual formula. This thing of darkness, I acknowledge, mine. If we're looking for a statement of intent for our shadow work, and perhaps a worthy statement of intent for this conference, then Shakespeare provides it. Jung writes, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The shadow appears as a rupture, a criminality, a mark of the primitive and the less ideal man, an idea that is contiguous with Kristeva's idea of the semiotic, which, and I quote, contains childish or primitive qualities which would vitalise and embellish human existence, but convention forbids it." I observe here that the occult in the modern world is taking on an even darker expression. There's a tendency to fall in thrall to the shadow and to transfer our loyalty to it. But as serious occultists, our goal is not to be subsumed to the shadow, but to be able to employ it at our bidding. As Jung observes, a man who is possessed by his own shadow is always standing in his own light and falling into his own traps. Ours then is a difficult task, the navigation of edge states in the pursuit of power. I purposefully do not say self-knowledge or self-realization, which may occur as side effects, but power, which is always the aim of occult practice. The site of inquiry is located in the body, because it is the body that partakes of the threshold of life and death, and is constructed of a pattern of light and shadow. Moving on to the body of shadow, body of surfaces. Michael Myler, in his emblem book Atlantia Fugiens, states in epigraph 45, "The sun and its shadow complete the work." This is a quote taken from the Araeus, written by the even more shadowy Hermes Trismegistus, who advises us to extract from the ray its shadow. Jung, having read The Alchemists, describes the shadow as the necessary component of a three-dimensional body. And it's Jung's idea of the shadow as part of a three-dimensional body which really intrigued me when I was researching this piece. The human body is a gnomon. The shadow is what places us in time and space. By reading the shadow, we know both who we are and where we are in relation to the light. The shadow revolves with the cosmic machinery. But the body is not a standing stone. It articulates a contrasting set of meanings, of stories and deceptions. The shadow is a dynamic form which the practitioner must learn to manipulate. or risks being manipulated by. The shadow is one of the better ways that we can communicate with subtle intelligences. However, my contention is that in the digital age, the shadow itself has been excised. The seeming aim of late capitalist culture is to produce what I've termed the body of services, by which I mean a virtual body that by definition can cast no shadow. It is entirely untethered from the relationship with light and shade the body affords and that the heavens enact. In our chemical terms, the body of services partakes of no natural processes, meaning that it is entirely inert. And nor is this body entitled to a shadow in the panopticon of the modern world, where it is lit from every direction. As moderns, we're becoming a screen for images that are projected onto us and onto our increasingly barren environment. There is simply no shadow play possible in the digital sensorium. As the old Topi proverb states, our enemies are flat. But to this we can now add, and so are our friends, and so are we. Our dreams are essentially being constructed for us by algorithms and are becoming indistinguishable from our diminished waking state, which is fractured by the small demands and gifts of mobile phone interactions. We find subtlety is lost in blank text, an exchange that's based on the banality of gifts and the use of crass emoticons. In our culture, the shadow has simply been swiped away. Therefore, the first paradoxical task for us in approaching the shadow is to recognise the body again. This is an issue that Freud or Jung never faced. The body itself has become the shadow in our world, and it has both waned and bloated. As a society, we find ourselves skinny fat, presenting a form which is idealised in the digital world, but on the other side of the screen, and without the Photoshop filters, is depressed, diseased, degenerate, and poverty-stricken. We are witnessing the entire loss of the body, and with it the shadow. And this reflects the changing shape of capitalism, with robotisation destroying jobs, manual factory work, and the professions as well. The erasure of the body is achieved by destruction of differences that accomplishes the triumph of the monoculture. It is a step towards our bio-obsolescence as production units or sources of value. The body itself is becoming surplus to requirements. That is, unless you wish to utilise its occult powers or its creative powers. Magic, art, and analysis may soon be the only things that computers cannot perform. Much of our social life is also relegated to this artificial world, which undeniably enables connection, but never allows consummation, for which we require shadows, for which we require flesh, and for which we require place. This will be the shape of the next revolution, which we see presaged politically by Occupy and currently in France with the Nuit debout, and magically with what's happening with the witchcraft revival. The most radical use of the internet is a means of coordinating physical bodies in actual space. Chimeras such as this conference is a demonstration that that's possible. I'm delighted that on a Friday, on a work day, we've managed to get this many bodies in place. So what I would argue is that we categorically don't require more information. We require as a culture more context, and that context is provided by the three-dimensional body and is explored through the use of the shadow arts. For my speciality in the occult, I argue that we require a renewed physical practice of restorative movement patterns, of an attention to diet, to breath, which have become largely the provenance of the high-resonance narcissists of the New Age and of the immortalist corporate high achievers. We've seen an almost total loss of physical culture in the occult and in the broader wasteland of paganism. We seem to have forgotten that witchcraft was once identical to anathematized forms of dance, whether la volta, the saraband, or more rustic revels, all of which required physical, moving bodies. Shadows, by their nature, are not fixed things, but live when they dance. So I can state categorically that the realm of the flesh is the realm of the shadow. In a Christian sense, matter is an illusory form that clothes the Holy Spirit. And in digital culture, the body is a meat sack, and the digital identity is where truth is to be sought. Mine, then, is a strictly satanic conception, a return to the body and a return to the world as the site of being. Such a view of an occult anatomy does not jump into Eastern ideas of chakras or belts or wheels or sheaths or any of this nonsense, but begins with the body itself and the body in relation to place. The occult has failed in seeking after this magical body. In shadow, it has been unable to relate to the physical body which casts it. This is a fundamental error which digital culture is magnifying as a status game played with no requirement to demonstrate proofs by an increasingly sick and dislocated population whose very starting point is a complete alienation from the corporeal. What I see often with occultists is that they're awakening into the occult, the shamanic crisis that we had described earlier, often coincides with a complete rejection of the body, a complete rejection of corporeal culture. And I'm not suggesting that the occult body needs to conform to any kind of Greek ideal, because the body and occult power often comes through being deeply hurt, through the crisis states. But that doesn't mean that we can't then pursue physical excellence in ability to function as effective ritualists. In fact, one could argue the ritual is accomplished by dance, by sound and sign making, all of which are attributes of the dynamic body in motion. With intent and training, these can extend from the body into the shadow and then be projected as occult power. This is the shape of our earliest forms of ritual. If we don't have to go back to the cave and imagine us observing our shadows as we dance and tell stories. So, how can we as sorcerers, whose art is that of the shadow, work with its most enduring forms? What strategies and ritual responses can we use to destroy the tyranny of the body of surfaces? How can we, as Jung suggests, repossess the shadow as the necessary component of a three-dimensional body? And I've talked of the body of as the shadow, but the shadow reveals the body. The intent concealed within the form. We often talk about the aura of an individual, but the shadow is often far more eloquent. When I'm in the audience at these conferences, I spend most of my time looking at the shadows of the presenters and watching what's going on with them. So witchcraft can be seen as an art of being able to draw shadows out of something, or of revealing what's been concealed from a client or what's being concealed from us. And in traditional witchcraft, we also understand that the shadow itself is vulnerable to injury and death. So if our shadows have been abducted by the body of surfaces, then we need to find them again, along with our ideas of secrecy, of agency, and of discretion. In working with the demonized forms of sexuality, with the drives, and let's be frank as we're among friends, the demons, we allow the shadow to manifest and to become more solid. When I talked earlier about the more antinomian forms of the occult, these can be considered a vital coagulation, a response to the nature of the culture that we find ourselves within. Furthermore, the shadow itself can provide a counter-magic or lay a curse upon the prevailing culture. The living shadow can disrupt a hierarchy or the ratio of the senses. So rather than meditating on the candle flame, we can observe the shadows around it. Rather than making our adorations to the sun or the moon, we can look at the shadows that they're casting.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a talk by Peter Gray. For more, visit his publishing company's website, scarletimprint.com. You can also visit the Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult site at psychartcult.org. And join us for Peter Gray's presentation, The Two Antichrists, at Morbid Anatomy Museum, online, Sunday, September 19th. Sign up at Morbid Anatomy Events, morbidanatomy.org/events. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. You can visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast main website, renderingunconscious.org, for links and more information. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at rawsin_. That's RAWSIN_. Rendering Unconscious is also a book, Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry, from Trapart Books 2019. For more information, you can visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast at our Patreon, patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. That's VANESSA23CARL. Your support is very appreciated. Thank you so much for supporting Rendering Unconscious podcast and all of my other creative endeavors. And now, The Psychic Censor, from the album This is Voyeurism, a collaboration I did with Pete Murphy. You can find this album and our other work at our Highbrow Lowlife Bandcamp page. That's highbrowlowlife.bandcamp.com.
Let me close this first.
the psychic censor. Wishing to remove ego-oriented, logical thought processes as much as possible. A singular poetic vision, integral to life. Break down the false division between life and art. Inspiration, attitude, refine it, integrate it into your vision. Echoes, 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 echoes. Free reign within the creative process. Create universes of your own. Creative impulse and intuitive decisions. Totally aware of his power, of his intelligence, of memory, knowledge, and suffering. Curious, the misery of life. Innovative. Meticulously planned and laid out, leaving nothing to chance, leaving everything to chance, focusing on the imagery, catapulted into the public domain. Viewers were outraged. They had never seen this kind of art and did not understand how to relate to it.